welcome back to another episode of the One Tree Hill Rewatch here on the Filmaholic channel. We are now on season 5 of One Tree Hill and talking about 2 episodes a day, and that's 503 and 504. We are moving along here. 503 aired January 15th, 2008. It's called My Way Home Is Through You. It's directed by David Jackson and written by John A. Norris. Both of these guys have done episodes before, so they are no stranger to the show, but this is their first time in the season 5 after we did that 4-year time jump from the high school years. The big thing about this episode for me is that Dan is back, my favorite character. We get a return of Dan in this episode, who is obviously in prison. But I feel like that's the big thing about this episode, because we haven't seen him. He's been mentioned in the first 2 episodes. We know he's in prison, but we see him for the first time, and it's Nathan going to visit him. And this is the first time that Nathan has visited Dan since he's been in prison. If you know, the end of season 4, Lucas and Nathan made a decision not to go see Dan ever, which I always felt like was strange for Nathan to make that decision. Obviously, Lucas would make that decision, but not Nathan, and he goes back again. He goes against it. He ends up going to see Dan. At this point, he says like he's been blaming Dan for the accident, blaming him, I guess, for the way Nathan is. But in general, I feel like also like it is part of that, part of him blaming Dan, needing to blame someone for this accident other than himself, but also the fact that he probably wanted to see his dad. This is, I'm sure he's been thinking a lot about him being in the situation that he is in, and the fact that Dan has went through, obviously not the same sort of situation. Dan never even got that far in his career, but the regrets, the bad decisions and everything, and he probably wants to go see Dan and talk to him about it. And that's what he does in this episode. He goes and visits him in prison, and they have a conversation, and they talk about it. I feel like it happens too fast. I wish we could have spent more time with him in jail. Him visiting Dan, more of their conversation, discussing really the decision that Nathan made in their relationship. But it's briefly touched upon in this one scene, and then it transitions into Dan asking about Jamie, which I love, because I love Dan and Jamie's relationship, as we get into that later in the season. But it's so sad, because Dan, when, Dan asks about Jamie, not saying his name, how is my grandson? Must be getting big by now. And he asks Nathan if he has a picture of him, and Dan, says, I'm not here to talk about Jamie. This is the first time that Dan's heard his name. The baby, he never got to hold Jamie. He turned himself in because Haley went into labor when he was turning himself in prison, so he never got to see Jamie as a baby. Nathan never came to visit, so he never knew his name, nothing about Jamie. So I'm sure he has so many questions, and I'm glad we do get to explore that later in the show. But then, Nathan reveals to Dan that Jamie did find a picture of Dan once and asked about him. And he told Jamie that that's your grandfather. And then he lies to Jamie and tells him that Dan is dead. Which obviously has to be even more heartbreaking to Dan, to have this. Like he says, he always wonders if Jamie knows about him. And the fact that he does, and the fact that he thinks he's dead, I'm sure, even at this point, that he has in the back of his mind, like, oh, maybe one day I'll have a relationship with this kid. And now it's like, he thinks you're dead, so, no. But it's interesting, that lie, because obviously as this season moves on, they start to have a relationship, but even then, the secret's kept about Dan killing Keith, from Jamie. Jamie doesn't find that out until much later in the show. But you got to know that's going to happen at some point. So it's interesting, I think, that whole thing, and we'll talk about it more as we move into their relationship and talking about that. But so that happens with Dan. Skills share. Mal's still in this stuff with Alice and her being mean to him, and Skills gives Mal this advice to kiss her. He gives a story about his professor. To me, I'm sorry, but that's all cringe. It's all poorly written for the time period that it came out. Like, it's all these, and I know Mark didn't write this episode, but he's still in the story group. He's still in shaping the stories that happen throughout this season, and the fact that you have these stories where characters are just kissing people and that don't want to be kissed. I don't know. It's pretty bad, and as we get into it later in the episode, obviously, the Mouth and Alice storyline is a thing in the season, and her character isn't upset, but she acts upset. So Mouth ends up kissing her, and she says, "You're fired." Turns out he's not fired. He ends up staying, and they have this sort of relationship in the next few episodes, Mouth and Alice. But his decision, and this doesn't feel like, maybe, I guess if you go back to the season 4 finale with him kissing Brooke, but I try not to think about that because I know who wrote it. But Mouth just straight up kissing his boss like that, and it's just like that sexual harassment. But yeah, it's the storyline they're telling this season, and it's one of the worst storylines in the season, definitely. Not a fan of it, and it's going to continue for the next few episodes. Haley and Lindsey have lunch in this episode, and they have lunch at the George, which is the restaurant in Wilmington. I haven't been there in a while, but I have been there a few times, and I do remember liking it both times that I did go. It's on the river, on the Cape Fear River, right off the river walk, and they have an outdoor area. That's where Haley and Lindsey eat in the episode, and that's also where we see Peyton come to see Ellie in season 3, at the beginning of season 3. So yeah, check it out if you're in Wilmington. Like I said, goes back to the Nathan and Dan situation. He's leaving, and they have a talk where Nathan's saying, "I'm finally letting you go. I won't be back to see you again. This is the final time I'm ever going to see you." And Dan's like, "That's the strength I gave you to leave your old man behind." And they have a talk, and, in this talk, too, Nathan continues about him not liking Jamie playing basketball, which we heard mentioned in the first few episodes. He says he'll never let his son play, and Dan's like, you not letting him play is just as bad as you making him play. Like, you need to let him make his own decisions, and don't make the same mistakes, just the opposite version of it, that I did with you. And then Nathan leaves, and we see Dan say, "I love you," even though Nathan doesn't hear him, and it just pulls at the heartstrings, that moment. And as we get to the end of the episode, which there's other stuff I'm going to cover here in a second, but as we get to the end of the episode, we find out that Nathan did leave a picture of Jamie for Dan, with a guard, and the guard brings it to Dan. And the last time we see Dan in this episode, he's holding that picture of Jamie and smiling, and it's a little beautiful moment that is going to add to the storyline in the season of how he knows what Jamie looks like as we get to the 100th episode, which is one of my favorite episodes, not only of the series, but definitely my favorite episode of this season. We also have the quote, which I have on my laptop, actually a sticker of that quote, that Karen had up on the cafe wall, and they're tearing it down, restructuring, building Clothes Over Bros in this episode. And Brooke sees it and decides to keep it, and she ends up hanging it above the door. So I love that. Love that addition to Clothes Over Bros. I wish I could actually... I wonder... a lot of times when I watch these episodes, I wonder what happened to some of these props, like that were stuff like that. It wasn't like a dresser or something they just sold. Like, these actual props. Like, I wonder what that is now. Did it just get destroyed? Or does somebody on the crew or cast have it? Because I would like to have that. That would be really cool to hang on the wall. It would take up a lot of space, but it would be really cool to have. There's the lucky bamboo thing with Lindsey in this episode. So she brings Peyton lucky bamboo. Peyton thinks it's a sign of marking her territory. She has a conversation with Lindsey about it and kind of comes off as a bitch. And then she talks to Brooke about it, and turns out she gave Brooke one too. So it's just kind of showing, obviously, Peyton lies about why she came back to Tree Hill. She came back to Tree Hill to be back there, to be with Brooke. She ends up starting her label, which we see the foundations being built for that in this episode here, 503. I think... Yeah, Kevin Federline is introduced in this episode too as Jason, the first artist that she tries to get, which overall, the Dick character that he plays is written so that we can get to Mia, played by Kate Vogel, who I love her music, and she becomes a big part of the show. moving forward. But she's introduced in the next episode, 504. The 503 is just about Jason, and it's really, but his storyline and his purpose of being there is just for us to get to Mia. I wish they'd chosen someone else other than K-Fed, though, because his music is garbage. Like, awful. Can't even understand what he's saying. I don't know who listens to this, but it's terrible. Like, but I don't know why Peyton would have ever chose to, sorry, there's a bee around here. I don't know why Peyton would have ever chose to do this, like choose him as an artist. It seems weird to me. Anyways, you have the stuff like Lucky Bamboo. It impacts Peyton, but she's really back in Tree Hill for Lucas. She misses him. She wants to get that relationship back, and that's the true reason she's back in Tree Hill. And Lindsey's in the way. We also have, on top of that, because she has a conversation with Haley too about it. I feel like Haley's the only LL shipper, Lucas and Lindsey shipper on the show. Obviously, Brooke is not. We see in this episode, even though we know the stuff with Brooke and Lucas and Peyton, still in the back of Brooke's mind has an effect on her. She is a latent shipper, along with most people, not just fans, but people on the show, other people. And I feel like Haley is the only Lucas and Lindsey shipper out there, but she definitely is, and we kind of put that in this episode, and it continues throughout this season, where she defends Lindsey. Her and Lindsey are friends. I guess, they have a much better relationship at this point than Haley and Peyton do. I don't feel like Haley... Well, they start to rebuild their relationship in this season with Haley helping out with the label. And then, obviously Haley takes over that label as we get into future seasons. But I feel like their friendship, which was a big part of season 1, I feel like really like their chemistry together. It's never really there as much. You can really get Brooke and Haley are the better friends moving forward, and that makes sense because of season 7 through 9. But yeah, so that's there. We also had the ending thing with Nathan shaving, and he sets up the family dinner table in the end of this episode and trying to fix the mistakes. This is like the first step at the beginning for their family moving forward, of him leaving the stuff in the past and shaping a new future. In this episode, and then also the big cliffhanger, the big thing at the end of the episode, we have Brooke and Peyton. Brooke gets a house in this episode too, by the way. She buys a house at the beach, which is filmed at Carolina Beach. So if you want to actually go visit this location, which I didn't do on the tour because we didn't go to Carolina Beach this time, we went to Wilmington, but because it's a little bit of, it's not a bad drive. Like, if you're there for a couple days, definitely go to Carolina Beach. Check out these filming locations. Go to the original Wake and Bake Donuts. Go to the state park at Carolina Beach. All that's really cool. Definitely check it out. But her house is actually there. She buys it from a lady in this episode. And the ending is Victoria finding her because it's been charged to the company. And as she comes up and they have a back and forth arguing about Brooke coming back to New York, it's revealed that Victoria is her mom. And that's kind of the cliffhanger of this episode. Which then we get into 504, which is the last episode I'm going to talk about here. It's called It's All Right, Ma, I'm Only Bleeding, and it aired January 22nd, 2008, was directed by Janice Cook, and written by Adele Lim. So this episode, the main thing about it is the opening of Close with the Bros in the Karen's Cafe location. So it shows her friends, Lucas, Peyton, other characters, helping out and getting this place ready. And then by the end of the episode, they have the grand opening of Close with the Bros in Tree Hill. It also is really a lot about exploring Brooke and Victoria's relationship, which we're going to do throughout the next little bit of this, or at least the first half of season 5, and definitely into season 6 and beyond, exploring their relationship. But we just found out at the end of the last episode that that's her mom, so in this episode, we're diving into that and exploring things, and we're showing Victoria see Lucas. She knows him from the past, but doesn't know him. And so I think this is the first time they've actually met, other than her just probably seeing him in a picture or something. And that's funny. We also have the exchanges between Victoria and Peyton. Obviously, they don't like each other. Victoria hates Peyton. Peyton's not a fan of Victoria either. But Peyton tries to be nice to Victoria in this episode and says, I'm glad that you're here supporting the store and supporting Brooke's desire to be in Tree Hill and Victoria's like, she's only here because you're a deadbeat and can't make it in LA. So stop ruining her life. Pretty much like you were in high school. So yeah, setting Victoria up as this bad character. And obviously, Victoria's not my favorite character. But she is one of the characters that I'm glad they don't keep bad throughout the show, even though she always has that Victoria character in her, how she is. They do evolve her character, and I'm glad because I feel like they should have done with her. Ted, Brooke's dad, completely feel the opposite. They messed it up bad in season 9 with his character. Should have made him awful, because him being awful and the way he is, and we'll talk about this more when we get there, goes to why Victoria is a lot of the reasons she is the way she is, So, problems with later in the show. But, yeah, I like how they write Victoria in this episode and in Season 5 and Season 6 in general, because it's all very, we understand she's a new good villain. I think they honestly pitched it. I think when Mark was talking to Daphne, who plays Victoria, about her, he was saying, you are what Dan was in the past. You're the new version of that. So she had that responsibility to carry. So I guess, I was saying how before there wasn't really an antagonist. She sort of is the antagonist in season 5 in a way, if you look at Brooke as, I guess, one of the lead. I mean, she is one of the leads, but which at this point in the show, I feel like if you look at when the show started, Lucas was the protagonist of the series. At this point, when we get to season 5, I don't think there is a protagonist anymore, or an antagonist. They all have their own storylines, and it's all there. It's all one collective group. It's not one person in particular. Obviously, season 1, Lucas was the protagonist, Dan was the antagonist. Dan, I feel like, was still the main antagonist through season 4, even though he changes in season 4. And you can still argue that Lucas was the protagonist through the high school years. Although a lot of the other characters have their own huge storylines, you can still argue that it was the protagonist and the antagonist of the series. When we get to season 5, that definitely changes. And then when we get to season 7, I would still say it's the same, but I would still argue that, I would argue that in season 7 through 9, Brooke is actually the protagonist of the series, and it just doesn't have an antagonist. But yeah, so not only do we explore the relationship with Victoria more in this episode, but she also tries to sabotage Brooke's opening of Close Over Bros by ordering all this high-end stuff that definitely isn't going to sell in Tree Hill, and Brooke doesn't know about it, and she tries to sabotage it because at the end of the night, they didn't make what they should have made, and not one of the high-end lines items were sold. So she's trying to shut the store down before it goes even any further. But Millie decides to buy one of the high-end dresses to show Victoria. So that happens, but then Brooke ends up, saying we have to frame this check, and Millie's like, well, if you frame it, you can't cash it, and that's the point, because definitely it would have bounced, as Millie says. So that was a really good scene, probably one of my favorite scenes with Millicent on the show. And I want to say that somebody kept that signed that check. I'm not sure if it was Sophia Bush or not. I feel like somebody did. I feel like I heard that at the end of the show, but I'm not sure. I'll look into some more of that later when we get to the end of the series, of what items actors kept, if I can find it. So that happens. We also have the Lucas and Peyton situation in this episode, like I said, with Lucking Bamboo. Peyton tries to apologize to Lindsey at the beginning of the episode, and she goes and asks her if she would like to come to Close Over Bros, the opening, with her. And Lindsey said, well, I'm going out of town, but you can go with Lucas. He doesn't like going to these things alone. And she's going to trust Peyton to do so because of how she's acted. It would be really awful if she tried to hit on her boyfriend after being, doing that to her. So Peyton and Lucas go to this thing together. Lucas picks Peyton up, and he's like, hey, we had a relationship, but before that we were friends, so maybe we can go back and try that again. So they go to this thing as friends. Well, that's how it starts off. But then when they're there, by the end of it, Peyton starts flirting with this guy who's been checking her out, this bartender. And when Lucas is ready to leave, he asks her, Peyton, are you ready to leave? And she's like, I think I'm going to stay for this bartender guy. And Lucas leans in and says, he's not good enough for you. Which is not fair for him to do that at all. But of course, the storyline they're telling, it works. And then we have this great scene of him standing outside of Clothes Over Bros, and Peyton and we follow Peyton out. She rushes out the door and just goes off. Peyton go off on Lucas. Great performance from Hillary of saying, "Hey, this isn't fair to me. It's not fair to Lindsey." I love that scene. Best scene of the episode. And then we also have, like I said, problems with Mouth and Alice in this episode as well. Continuing that because he's kind of jealous that she's there with another guy. I guess he wants more out of it, just the sex between them. Obviously, Mouth is like that as a character, but look at the situation he got into. I don't know how you feel like it could have been any different. He also meets Millicent in this episode, which we know the story with Mouth and Millicent as the course of the series goes. They end up together at the end of the series. So it's a long journey, and it starts in this episode. But you have that Alice stuff going on, so they don't really... I think it's one of the next upcoming episodes, you start to spend more time with Mouth and Millicent, but it's ruined by Alice again until they get rid of Alice completely, which is... Thank God they did that. We have the Nathan Quentin stuff in this episode as well, expanding on that. He gets Quentin back on the team, talks to Lucas, he gets it back on the team, unfortunately, but I do like their story as they continue on in the show. But yeah, that's 504. The next episode we're going to get into is 505, which is a really good episode, one of my favorites of the season as well. But that'll be coming shortly for you guys. Don't forget to like and subscribe.